Hello everyone, today I have Mark Wolynn with me. He is the author of the book It Didn't Start With You, How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle. Mark is the director of the Family Constellation Institute in San Francisco, and Mark's book has been translated into 19 languages, one of them being Turkish. Mark, it's so nice to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Ipek. I'm happy to talk with you.
Okay, Mark, so let's start with your definition of inherited trauma. How would you describe this concept for us?
So let's say one of our parents or our grandparents suffered a tragedy. Maybe they lost their mother or their father when they were young, or they were sent away to boarding school very early, or they were placed in an orphanage, or one of their siblings died tragically, and this event, broke the heart of our parents. When we have a trauma like this, the reaction to the trauma doesn't necessarily stop with the people who experienced it. The feelings, the sensations, specifically the stress response, can be passed to our children and to our grandchildren. And we now have a lot of biological evidence for this.
Wow, that's definitely very interesting. And just to make it a little bit more clear, can you share a case with us that illustrates inherited trauma?
Yeah, I'd be happy. I once worked with a 16-year-old boy who had a rare neurological disorder. When he was 10 years old, he began to experience intense burning sensations on his skin, and the doctors couldn't figure out why this was happening. They couldn't find any root cause. So when I was speaking with his mother, she told me about a trauma his father had experienced when the father was around the same age, 10. The father was playing with matches, and he accidentally set the garage on fire, which was attached to the house. And the house burned down, and the father's brother died in the fire. And the father never forgave himself for this. And because the trauma remained unhealed and unresolved in this family, the man's son expressed symptoms, burning sensations on his skin, at a similar age, at the same age actually. And the family never made the connection. And so after working with the family, the boy's symptoms disappeared. And, things like this happen all the time, Ipek. I'll be working with people, but they don't think to question beyond this generation. They don't think that their shutdowns, their depressions, their anxieties, their symptoms can be connected with anything that happened to their parents and their grandparents. Just like we were talking about a few minutes ago, once you open this door, you can't shut the door. It gives you a whole new lens with which to look at the effects of trauma.
Exactly. Thank you so much. And wow, what a case. And in your book, you talk about many more different cases like this. And like you said, it gives you such a perspective that it's too late. Once you learn about it, you start seeing people that way. And it's wonderful. So, Mark, you are the creator of the core language approach. And you talk about how we all have our own trauma language in your book. Can you tell us more about what core language is?
Yes, of course. So I've discovered that when a trauma happens, it leaves clues behind, clues in the form of emotionally charged words and sentences that live inside us, that form a breadcrumb trail. And when we learn how to listen for it and follow this language, it's like finding the missing piece of the puzzle, which allows the whole picture to come into view and finally gives us a context for why we feel the way we feel. It's essential that we, both as therapists and non-therapists, learn to listen to what we say, this trauma language. We know from trauma theory that when a traumatic event happens, significant information of this event bypasses the frontal lobes. So the experience of exactly what happened to us in a trauma can't be named or ordered in words because our language centers in the brain become compromised. And then without language, our experiences get stored as fragments in the body, fragments of memory, fragments of body sensations, fragments of images, fragments of language, trauma language, what I call core language, fragments of emotions. It's like the mind disperses and then essential elements get separated and we lose the story, Ipek, and we never complete the healing when there's been a trauma. Yet I've discovered these pieces, they're not lost. They've simply been rerouted and can resurface in our verbal and our non-verbal trauma language. So when it's verbal, it's a sentence like, I'll do something terrible, I'll harm somebody, I'll go crazy, I'll be put in jail. This is verbal trauma language. But when it's non-verbal trauma language, we have to look for the physical and emotional symptoms that show up after an unsettling event. Similar to this boy at the same age 10, when the father was playing with matches, pieces of that trauma start rising to the surface. So this nonverbal language were the boy's burning skin. We also look for fears and anxieties that strike suddenly when we reach a particular age 10, like that boy. And often it's the same age that something terrible happened in the family history. We also look for depression or destructive behaviors that show up, that arise after a situation that's similar to some trauma in our family history. This nonverbal trauma language, it's also mirrored in our relationships, in our relationship struggles, in the types of partners we choose, in the events that happen to us. For example, mom is mistreated by dad, and then we get married and we're mistreated by our partner. It's also in the repeated ways we deal with money and success. All of this forms a breadcrumb trail that we need to follow.
Very, very interesting. And I guess parallel with your response, one can help but wonder, some children who grow up with addicted or abusive parents, sometimes they become addicts or, violent people themselves. How do you explain this pattern?
Well, it depends. Did one of those events break our attachment with our mother, which is if we have parents that are addicts, then even if our dad is an alcoholic and our mom is stressed and worried and feels trapped and doesn't know how she's going to care for the kids, this takes her attention away from her mothering and it breaks the attunement with the child. So some of this can be explained by a break in the attachment. Some of this can be explained by repetition. Dad suffers, I suffer. Dad drinks, I drink. Mom gives a child away, I abort my first child. Dad fails at age 40, I fail as soon as I hit 40, 41. So we can repeat, and we can also, we have to understand the effects of trauma affect mothering and fathering, affect parenting. Yeah.
Okay. So many of us, we go through difficulties in life and feel stuck at times. Sometimes we know why, but most often we just don't seem to find where they stem from. How can someone tell if he or she might be suffering from an inherited trauma, and what are the signs?
Yeah, there are definitely signs of, we can be born with an anxiety or a depression, that's true, and never separate it from the events of the previous generation. But we can also as I was talking earlier about this nonverbal trauma language, we can also experience a fear or a symptom that strikes suddenly when we reach a certain age, like that boy who was 10, when his father had that trauma at 10. But for us, maybe, our grandmother became a widow at 30, and then our parents began to disconnect from each other around age 30. And then all of a sudden we look at our husband or wife or partner at age 30 and we think, I just don't feel it anymore. Never connecting that never connecting that the age was the trigger. The age 30 was the silent, hidden trigger. We can also hit an event or a milestone in our lives. For example, we get married.
Yeah.
We get married. And then all of a sudden, everything starts to arise. In the book, I talk about an Iraqi woman who she loved her husband. She wanted to marry him. It was the perfect guy for her. But as soon as she was married, she felt trapped and she didn't understand it. And she came to me to work with this. And I said, well, let's look in your family history. And we found out that both grandmothers were given away as child brides, one at 9 and one at 12, they were children, to much older men. And it was so interesting. I worked with her and her 2 sisters. She feels trapped as soon as she gets married. The other sister marries a man 30 years older, like the grandmothers who lived these loveless, trapped lives with these older guys who were in their 40s and their children. And the third sister, she would never get in a relationship at all, lest she be trapped. So another trigger, one is when we get age, one is when we get married, another one is when we move to a new place. And then suddenly we become depressed and we don't understand it because what's been triggered in the move is the experience of our ancestors who maybe were persecuted or were forced out of their homeland, and they suffered deeply. So here we are, and all we do is move across the city or move to a new town, and we're depressed like these ancestors that were persecuted and forced out or killed or oppressed. Another trigger, Ipek, is when we get rejected by a partner. And all of a sudden, even if we've only been with this partner 2 months, the rejection forces an earlier rejection. And then all of a sudden, the grief is insurmountable. And it takes us back to a much earlier grief, often a break in the attachment with our mother. So we don't make the connection, but all of a sudden somebody breaks up with us and we go, oh, I don't want to live anymore, which would be a baby's feeling when there's been this break with the mother. Another trigger, this is the last one I'll mention, is when we go to have a child and everything's okay, we're happy, but all of a sudden we get pregnant and it's as though there's this ancestral alarm clock that starts ringing. I once worked with this woman who was consumed with anxiety. And as soon as she didn't realize what the trigger was, but I said to her, so when did this anxiety start? And she said, 7 months ago. And I said, what happened 8 months ago? What happened 7 months ago? She goes, well, that's when I became pregnant. And of course, that was the trigger. I said, what's the worst thing that will happen to you if you have a child? And immediately she told me, I'll harm my baby. And I said, did you ever harm a baby? And she said, no, of course not. And then I said, did anyone in your family ever harm a baby? And she was about to say no. And she said, oh my God. My grandmother, as a young woman, she lit a candle in the house and caught the curtains on fire and the house on fire. Her baby was upstairs and she couldn't get the baby out and the baby died. And then she said to me, but we were never allowed to talk about it. And I've discovered that traumas that are ignored, excluded, pushed away, forgotten, these people that are ignored, excluded, rejected, this creates a fertile ground for repetition and reliving. And once she was made the connection that she was carrying her grandmother's terror from what had really happened, and in her life, it was a fear from something that really did happen 2 generations earlier, we could work with it, and then we could break the pattern.
Wow, very interesting. So you talked about marriage, age, having children, and then breakups as some of the main triggers.
Yeah, these are some of the triggers. Why is this? Why are we triggered? For this, we have to look at the science. When a trauma happens, it not only leaves language, but it changes us biologically, physiologically. It causes a molecular change, a chemical change in our DNA. Mm-hmm. And this changes the way our genes function, sometimes for generations. Technically, a chemical tag, what's called an epigenetic tag, will attach to our DNA. Mm-hmm. And it will tell the cells to use or ignore certain genes to help us survive, to help us better deal with this trauma that just happened. And then the way our genes are affected changes how we act or feel. For example, we can become sensitive mm-hmm. or reactive to certain situations that are similar to an original trauma, even if that trauma occurred in a past generation. So we have a better chance of dealing with it, surviving in our generation. So yes, these triggers are reminiscent of events in either our early childhood, our infancy, mm-hmm. our pregnancy with our mother, or events in our mom and dad's lives, our uncles or aunts' lives, our grandparents' lives, et cetera, et cetera.
So it doesn't have to be your immediate parents or grandparents. It could also be your uncles, aunts, as other family members.
Absolutely. It can even be perpetrators in the family history, mm-hmm. Victims in the family history. Let's say our grandfather owned a factory and he made a lot of money, but didn't pay his workers well. And the workers suffered and didn't have enough to live on. Victims, become part of our family history. And we, generations later, can squander all our money and not hold on to money and feel like we're being cheated or ripped off, or, we could have an identification with the victims or with the perpetrators.
Very, very interesting. And another question I have for you is, I guess, you already responded to some of it. And when you explain the core language of relationships, you talk about how the problems that emerge in the relationships, they actually do not originate in the relationships themselves.
70% of, in my experience, of relationship issues originate prior. 30%, in my experience, comes from between the couple. 70% comes from our relationship with our mother, our relationship with our father, their relationship, our parents' relationship with each other, our grandparents' relationship with each other, former husbands and wives, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, family history.
And your book definitely gives us a really great guide to explore this connection with the exercises and the questions that you ask in between your chapters. So it's very helpful. So reading your book, it gives us a very clear roadmap about the steps that we can take to identify our own inherited trauma. And once the trauma is identified, how do we heal and how do we break the cycle?
So, as you know from my book, it's three parts in a way. At first, I teach people how to become detectives of, their family history, detectives of their trauma language, what I call core language. So the first thing is we have to identify what's going on. What is our issue? What I call our core complaint. And then what is our core sentence, which is what I call the core sentence is, what is our worst fear? And once we're able to identify the core complaint, the core descriptors, the core sentence, and the core trauma, the first part of the book, the second part of the book, I teach people how to link it in the family history, to do the traumagram, the genogram, the traumagram, to be able to link it to events in the family history. And then the third part of the book, I teach how we heal, which is, the most important part. What do we need to do to break the cycle of inherited trauma? Because if we don't, the traumas keep repeating and keep repeating. And to heal, we've got to calm the brain's stress response. Whether we've inherited that stress response from our parents or grandparents, or the trauma happened to us in utero because our mother lost a baby, a stillbirth before us, or our mom had multiple miscarriages and thought we would die too. And she didn't attune in the pregnancy. And so, there's events in utero, events between our parents, events in the family history. So we're looking, we're developing in the book this core language map to figure out where it is. But in order to heal, to put it very simply, we've got to have positive experiences that can change our brain. And then we need to practice the new feelings and the new sensations associated with these positive experiences. When we do that, when we do these practices, we not only create new neural pathways in our brain, we also stimulate the release of feel-good neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, GABA. We also stimulate the release of feel-good hormones in our body, like estrogen or oxytocin. Even the very genes involved in the body's stress response can begin to function in a new way. We can change the way our DNA expresses. So these positive experiences can be practices of receiving, I focus on the book a lot about practices of receiving comfort and support where there was none. Or we develop feelings of compassion for ourselves or for what our parents had gone through, our grandparents had gone through. Or we have a gratitude practice, or a practice of generosity, or a practice of loving kindness, or mindfulness. Ultimately, anything that allows us to feel strength or peace or joy inside. Because these, or curiosity or wonder or awe, because these types of experiences feed the prefrontal cortex and can help us reframe that stress response so it has a chance to calm down. I mean, ultimately, the idea is to pull energy away, pull traction away from the limbic system, the amygdala, the overactive amygdala, and bring engagement to the prefrontal cortex, where we can integrate these new experiences, these positive experiences, these positive sensations, and our brains can change.
Thank you. And in your book, you talk about the biology, the brain chemistry aspect of your series too, which is definitely very, very helpful. So in your book, it definitely invites us, your readers, on a journey to explore what our parents, grandparents, other family members have been through in their lives. In some families, though, like you said earlier, people just don't talk about these issues. So how can one find out about their family history if they don't have enough information already, or if they have lost their parents, or if for some reason they might be just cut off?
Or they're adopted. Yeah. This information, it lives in our trauma language. Whether, even if we don't know what happened, because parents often have this idea, I'm going to immunize my children from all this bad stuff that happened by not talking about it. And that's not the best strategy. Parents think, if I don't say anything, then my children won't be connected with it. But because we're talking about a biological connection, it doesn't help the children. So, much of this history is lost because it's been silenced, or, our parents don't talk about it, we're adopted, but it lives in our fears. It's in our unexplained symptoms. It's in our migraines and the age that the migraine started. It's in our irritable bowel syndrome and what preceded it, what events happened right before we got sick, or what events happen every time we have a bout of irritable bowel syndrome. There's a repetition. It lives in as I'm saying, it lives in the symptoms of our illness. It lives in our destructive or self-sabotaging behaviors. What's going on every time you cut yourself? What's going on every time you create conflict with your partner? What's going on every time the symptoms of the illness arise? Because it lives in, what age did this happen? As I said earlier, when we talked about nonverbal trauma language, we have to look at the unsettling events, the disruptive events, what age they started, because this all forms a breadcrumb trail and can give us a glimpse of what's happening in our family history, even if we don't know about it. Ipek, I feel like I should talk a little bit about some of the science, just so people understand what's being passed forward. Is it okay if I take a minute to do that?
Yes, that would be really helpful.
Let me give an analogy of what happens. Let me talk about, for example, let's say our grandparents came from during when they, 60 years ago, there was a war in our country, which is most of our countries. It's been true, So if our grandparents came from a war-torn country, let's say, and people were being shot, and bombs are going off, or uniformed men are lining people up in the square, or people are being taken away, or shot, or killed, or we never see them again. Our grandparents could develop and pass forward a skill set, an epigenetic adaptation to the stuff going on. For example, the skill set could be, on the good side, sharper reflexes, quicker reaction times, reactions to the violence, to help them survive what's going on, this trauma. But that's what they're passing down. This trauma of war is being passed down to us. But the problem for us is we could inherit their stress response, maybe even with the dials set to 10, prepared for this catastrophe of war, which isn't happening in our generation. And we don't make the link that our anxiety, our hypervigilance, our depression could be connected to their trauma. We just think we're wired this way. And now here we are passing this stress response, these gene changes to our children and then to their children. And, they're doing a lot of studies right now with mice. We can show these patterns easily in humans for 2 generations. But studies with mice can show that these expressions can be observed for 3 generations. And we ask, why mice? Humans and mice, they share a very similar genetic makeup, with 80%, over 90, 92, 93% of the genes in humans have counterparts in mice, with over 80% being identical. And plus we can get a new generation in mice in 12 weeks, 12 to 20 weeks, where it takes 12 to 20 years to get a new generation in humans. So of course it slows everything down. There's these great studies, one of them done, I listed in the book, at Emory Medical School in Atlanta, where they took male mice and they made them fear a cherry blossom-like smell. And every time this scent came into the cage, they shocked the mice. And they could see right in that first generation that the shocked mice had changes in their blood, in their brain, and in the sperm. Actually, in their brain, there were enlarged areas where there was a greater amount of smell receptors, so that the mice could detect this scent at lesser concentrations and protect themselves. Because if they smelled it sooner, they could tighten and brace and protect themselves from this shock. So the researchers had an idea. They said, what happens if we take some of this sperm and inject it, impregnate females who are not shocked, and let's see what happens. Well, the amazing thing happened is what happened in the second and third generations. The pups and the grandpups became jumpy and jittery just by smelling the smell without even being shocked. They had inherited the stress response without directly experiencing the traumas. What the studies that we're seeing nowadays, the most common studies in epigenetics, are they take baby mice and they separate them from their moms for even just a short period of time. You know, there's this one passage in my book that I'll read to you. You know, the baby mice are separated, and then they can observe the effects for 3 generations. I'll read these 4 lines from my book because it's significant. In one such study, researchers prevented the females from nurturing their pups for up to 3 hours a day, just for the first 2 weeks of life. Later in their life, these kids, their offspring, exhibited behaviors similar to what we call depression in humans. The symptoms seemed to worsen as the mice aged. And surprisingly, some of the males did not express the symptoms themselves, these behaviors themselves, but appeared to epigenetically transmit the behavioral changes to their female offspring. That would be like fathers going off to war and coming back numb from the trauma, and their daughters carrying the father's fight or flight or freeze response, his shake, his terror, his dissociation, his shutdown. And it's not just fathers and daughters. What we know, Ipek, is inherited family trauma is an equal opportunity employer. Male children and female children are equally impacted by a mother's trauma or a father's trauma. You know, you're probably on my Facebook page, but every week I list all the new studies that are released each week. There's a recent study in the Journal of American Medicine, JAMA Psychiatry, Journal of American Medicine Psychiatry, that followed mothers who suffered trauma as children and found that their daughters were more likely to struggle with depression and bipolar disorder. And there was a recent Tufts University study that followed men who suffered trauma as children and found out they were able to pass their anxiety onto their children through their sperm. And what was interesting about this study is that this is the first study to show that human sperm mirrored the same changes as the mice sperm. You know, there were the same non-coding RNA changes found in mice as in humans. The mice that were traumatized as pups by being separated from their mothers were similar in the human studies.
So our fears and anxieties exist before we were even born.
Exactly. You know, our sperm cells and egg cells carry the effects of trauma. Our mother's egg cells, our father's sperm cells carry the effects of trauma. And something in their bodies informs the egg, informs the sperm, hey, we need to remember this. So we need to be safe. And these effects are passed down to the generations to make sure they understand that this trauma is serious business. And then these gene changes from the eggs and the sperm, the embryo, are expressed in us. So we remember what they suffered with. We remember what our grandfather experienced as terrible. We remember what our grandmother experienced as terrible, what our parents experienced as terrible, so that we can stay safe by having these gene changes. Yeah, it's amazing.
It is amazing. So is it that once you externalize where that anxiety or fear might be coming from, that may be starting the process of healing then?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, that's why I teach people to listen to this trauma language, because it's the easiest way to find, to find what we carry. Another easy way is to, where in our bodies do we carry our symptoms? Where do you carry your fear? Where do you carry your physical bowel or gut symptoms? Do you have headaches? Do you have tightness? These are places in our body that are predisposed to carry the traumas of our early experiences and our family experiences. In the book, I ask people that question: what's your worst fear? What's the worst thing that could happen to you? If something terrible happened, if things suddenly fell apart, what's the worst thing? What's your worst fear? And people give these answers. I'll be abandoned, or I'll be left, or I'll be rejected, or I'll hurt a child, or my everyone will leave me, or my family will die, or these are it's an easy way to tell what we carry. And I have people, as you know, write that answer to what is your worst fear on top of your genogram, so we can see who in the family felt the same way. So yes, it is essentially very important to isolate and locate our trauma language, and then to start looking in the family history for events that may have spawned this trauma language, birthed it.
Exactly. And that's the reason, if anybody hasn't read your book yet, I would definitely recommend them to have a pen and paper ready and just do all the exercises, all the questions that you walk us through, because at the end you have a really nice way of putting everything all together, and everything makes so much sense once you put all the pieces together.
Thank you, Ipek. Yeah, thank you. I worked so hard on the book. I spent 9 years writing it, and I'm so glad it's English and then 19 other languages, including Turkish, where it is. I don't know if I'm saying this the right way, but it's çok satan.
Çok satan.
Yeah, I saw somebody sent me a picture of çok satan. There was Harry Potter's book, and then my book next to Harry Potter's book. Harry Potter, J.D. Rowling's Harry Potter, and my book were both çok satan, and it was so exciting to know that the Turks are reading, more than any other country, I think.
Yes.
The Turks, I mean, it does well in other countries too, but I'm so excited about the Turks, how they're drawn to look inside themselves and drawn to understand what creates these traumas. It's so beautiful, really, to see how interested the Turks are in self-help and self-growth and developing themselves and looking at themselves. And, my hat goes off to the Turks for their deep interest in depth psychology.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and we have a lot of trauma as a nation, but at the same time, as you said, as a culture, we are very interested in those introspects, but at the same time, when you think about it, people cannot go to a therapist as easily as we can here in the United States. Some of the insurances don't cover it. The services are very, very expensive, but people have this need to heal and to get to know themselves and to gain the insight. And reading your book is definitely very therapeutic. And I think on a different way, it's kind of fulfilling that sense, because you are having a dialogue with your audience, with your readers in the book, and it almost feels like somebody's having a conversation with their therapist as they're reading it. So that might...
Did you read it in English or did you read it in Turkish?
I read it in English, yes.
What's the name of it in Turkish? Can you say it for me?
Seninle Başlamadı.
I can't say it, but yes, that's it. So yes, I am having a dialogue with the reader, and I'm teaching the reader how to have healing sentences. See, I'm big on language, right? My background, of course, is poetry. My graduate work was not psychology, even though I'm the trainer of psychologists and I teach in psychiatry schools and medical schools. My background is language. And I'm very fascinated and interested in how language articulates with psychology. So I've developed not only this way of looking at trauma language, but also this way of looking at healing language. So I give the reader not just healing rituals and healing ceremonies and healing practices, but also healing sentences to say to the grandmother, to say to the mother, to say to the father. And it's very helpful.
It is definitely. So when I announced that I was having an interview with you, I did ask my followers to send me some of the questions that they would like me to ask you. And I'm just going to pick one and then ask you. One of them is, in Enmeshed Families, which is actually a really big part of the Turkish culture, how can adults protect the boundaries between themselves and their parents? And I guess reading your book, I wonder if it's too late to break this pattern because it's so established already. What do you think?
When parents suffer because, they're not happily married, or they didn't get a lot of love or nurturance or attunement from their parents, often they lean into their children. They don't mean to do it, but they lean toward sharing too much, making the child a confidant, expecting the child to take care of their feelings. And this creates, as we talk about, enmeshment. Parents that received a lot from their parents and have marriages that are solid often don't lean toward the children, but lean back to give the children support. But we, from enmeshed cultures, definitely Mediterranean cultures, we definitely tend toward having more enmeshed families. And we must break these enmeshments. We must break this need to feel responsible for our parents' feelings. So in the book, I talk about this one woman who took a piece of yarn and she sat on the floor and she put this yarn all around her body as a boundary. And so she would breathe, and every time she would exhale, she would fill up this outer boundary so she could have inner boundary sensation of a boundary between her and her mother. I also give sentences in the book to break these enmeshments, and also movements of stepping away. Sometimes, if I'm working with somebody online, I might say, hey, Ipek, go get a pair of flip-flops and put them in the office when I'm working with you, where your mother and where your father would be. And then as we're working, I might have you go out and stand on the flip-flops to experience what your mother or what your father was feeling in his life or her life. More than that, I might say, Ipek, with your mother's footprints so close, how is that for your body? And you might say, I can't breathe. It feels tight. I feel like my shoulders are coming forward. I feel like I want to go back. And I might say, let's move those footprints 2 steps back, 3 steps back, 4 steps back, 5, and then also maybe have this boundary. And then what happens? And Ipek reports, not you, anybody, right? Reports, I can breathe. Oh, that space is what I needed. So then I might give sentences to say, Mom, from now on, this is my boundary. Only my feelings are allowed in here. Only my sensations. Your feelings, your sensations, your worries, your fears, all the ways you believe you think about dad, all the things you think about me, all of this has to stay over there in your boundary, in your space. I no longer let it in my boundary. Me and what's mine over here. You and what's yours over there. On those flip-flops that are now 3-4 steps away with the boundary of the yarn separate. So I have lots of practices in the book I teach and sentences I give to help us break these Mediterranean enmeshments.
Exactly. Thank you for all this valuable information, Mark. Any final words that you would like to let your Turkish fans know about?
Yeah, when we've suffered or our children have suffered, it's really important to shake the family tree and see what falls out. What stories never got told or didn't get told all the way. What traumas never healed all the way, what family secrets, never got told. We might have to ask our cousins or our aunts or our uncles. And then once we shake the tree and see what falls out, we've got to talk about these traumas in our family history and try to work through them so that they're not passed down to our children. Because the more we know about these traumas and the more we can explain what happened, the more we can talk about what happened, the more we can bring relief to our children and their children who are suffering without a clue. They don't know why they're suffering. I found that if we ignore the past, it will come back to haunt us. But the more we explore it, we don't have to repeat it. We can break these destructive patterns. We can break the cycle. Inherited family trauma, it may be a reality, but it doesn't have to be our destiny.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. It was wonderful. All the information that you shared is wonderful. The book is amazing itself. So from here, as somebody who read it, as someone who applied it to, her personal life and also professional life, I would definitely recommend everybody to read it. There's many more in your book, and you also share your own story of how you got into this field, which is very, very emotional and influential. So I'm sure your readers will read more about that or have read about it already.
Oh, thank you for having me, Ipek. I enjoyed our conversation. And merhaba to the Turkish people who bought my book and who have been reading it and deepening their psychological and emotional landscape. And gule gule.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.